overthinking is really distinct to the modern age, this time when there's this almost capitalistic pressure to know everything under the sun, which has combined with mass loneliness and, yeah, just the sort of false impression that because the internet exists, everything is knowable.
Our dilemma is that we have ancient limbic systems, medieval institutions, but godlike technology. Welcome to the Psychobabble podcast. I'm your host, Joe Nucci, and today I have the great privilege of sitting down with an author of one of my favorite books that I read, or should I say listened to, last year. I'm here with Amanda Montell. Hey, Amanda, it's super cool to get to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hello, oh my gosh, thanks for having me. What a delight to bring this parasocial relationship a little more social.
Exactly. Yes, it is true. For those who are curious, we did connect over DM, even though I was familiar with who you were before.
And
we started following
likewise,
each other.
yes, we have some mutual interests, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just dive right into it. So I got to listen to your book on Spotify. It's called The Age of Magical Overthinking. And one of the things that I loved about it was that you really in-depth and very carefully reviewed so much psychological literature, but not even just literature, just different like ideas and frameworks and perspectives. And it's a lot of areas of psychology that I find interesting because I'm a psychology nerd. Like, I'm assuming you identify that way as well. But it's not necessarily literature that I'm absorbing every single day. Having said that, I found it very relevant to how I think about myself and my work, not just as a therapist, but also on social media, because your book is, I would be curious how you would put it, but it's just about this kind of dizzying time that we live in the age of information.
Yeah, that's a great way of summarizing it. Yeah. So my background is not in psychology or in, clinical therapy or anything like that. My undergraduate degree is in linguistics, and that's the theme of my first two books. The first one is about language and gender. It's called Word Slut, and the second one is about the language of cults, from Scientology to SoulCycle. So this wide spectrum of cultish groups, and that book is called Cultish. And from much of the literature that I was reading and absorbing for my research process for Cultish, I became super interested in behavioral economics and psychology concepts that could explain so many of the modern day irrationalities that I was perceiving in the zeitgeist and my own personal life. Everything from the extreme cycles of celebrity worship and dethronement that we see in our society, which I explore through a cognitive bias called the halo effect, to how the sunk cost fallacy could explain my decision to spend so many of my formative years in a relationship that I knew was causing me suffering. So my sort of like shtick as a writer is to take psychology and social science subjects, linguistic subjects that might be a little like heady or even kept on a high shelf of academia, and to synthesize them and filter them through my sort of pop culture lens in a way that's hopefully really accessible and fun to read.
Yeah. Before we started recording, you said something that I found very insightful, which you were saying, it was something like, I love the social sciences because of how they all bleed into each other. And I really love that perspective, and kind of just kind of owning the fact that you identify just like as a writer, or I don't know if you identify like as a journalist or like a media person, but I think that oftentimes a lot of these subjects in their ivory towers of academia, like, the researcher way of thinking about these things is to really like operationalize your terms and to like, like really delineate different things. But that's just not how the real world works. And it's not how people are having conversations about these terms. And it's not often the best way to teach people about these terms either. So I love that reframe of just kind of like, I think it's great that it bleeds into one another, that, therapy can have overlap with behavioral econ, which can overlap with cognitive psych, which can have overlap with neuro, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I love how the social sciences overlap. I am that like Kamala Harris meme where I'm like, I love a Venn diagram. I kind of identify as, I don't know, maybe like the proxy between academic literature and general readers. I'm just like a very curious person, and I love to read empirical studies, but I also more so love to talk about them. And my voice is very sort of like colloquial. And I love to sort of apply social science concepts, whether we're talking about some empirical language and gender study from the field of linguistics or, a study about a cognitive bias from behavioral economics. I love to talk about them rather in the context of, I don't know, like celebrities or influencers or modern day phenomena, relationships that they totally do apply to, but that you would never necessarily read an academic paper about, if that makes sense.
Totally, absolutely. Well, with that, I would love to just start talking about the book. And I was going over it again before our call, and there's I think it's in either the intro or one of the earlier chapters. You say we're living in what they call the information age, but life only seems to be making less sense. And then you talk about how every generation kind of has to figure out their calling, and you hypothesize, you put forth this idea that our generation's mission has to do with the mind. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what did you mean? Because I know that really hit me when I was first listening to it.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So I came across this quote from the Marxist philosopher Frantz Fanon, which I'll summarize. It says something like, every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. Actually, that's verbatim the quote. And,
I was about to say that is what you said.
that is verbatim the quote. And it has been occurring to me over these many years of thinking about and writing about kind of abstract concepts like language and power and culture that so many of the survival instincts or sort of like imperfect but ultimately resource rational or efficient behaviors that human beings came up with to make it through to reproductive age, to keep our society moving forward, are now being mapped onto situations where they ultimately don't serve us in the information age, in the digital age. And that's really ultimately what this book is about. I called it the age of magical overthinking because magical thinking all on its own is an age-old human coping mechanism. It's our penchant to think that our thoughts and our feelings and what's going on internally can affect the external world. And we often rely on magical thinking during times of personal or global crisis, from the death of a loved one to a high stakes election season. We start to, drop our critical thinking skills and rely on magical thinking to cope. But I find that overthinking is really distinct to the modern age, this time when there's this almost capitalistic pressure to know everything under the sun, which has combined with mass loneliness and, yeah, just the sort of false impression that because the internet exists, everything is knowable. And human beings, we are rational. We are not robots. We're these sort of mystical creatures. And the ways that we've always made decisions that were good enough, again, to help us survive, aren't always so useful now that our world has become a lot more cerebral and abstract. And that's not to say that we don't still have physical problems. We most certainly do. And the spectrum of those physical problems is very wide depending on where someone lives, someone's level of privilege. I hope that's obvious. But I'm just really interested in how our innate human decision-making processes and mysticisms are clashing with this particular time in history.
Yeah. What's coming up for me is this E.O. Wilson quote. I first learned of it through the Center for Humane Tech. So they did the documentary The Social Dilemma, and it's a lot of kind of social media and like tech giants who are kind of speaking out against some of the ways our world is currently being designed. And the
Yeah.
quote is something like, our dilemma is that we have ancient limbic systems, medieval institutions, but godlike technology. I have a very dear friend, also named Amanda, actually, who, whenever someone jokes about saying they're like, oh, like I'm addicted to my phone, she kind of snarkily goes, "It's the most amazing piece of technology we've ever had in all of human history. Like, why wouldn't you be addicted to it?" and
Yeah,
and and there's the rub, right?
I like that. I like that point of view. Shout out to my fellow Amanda. Was she born in 1992? Because it was the
Oh,
number one baby girl name that year. Um, but yeah, no, I think we're often like pretty hard on ourselves when it comes to these irrational behaviors. Like we're often mysteries to ourselves, right? Like there are so many behaviors that I was able to explore in the book of my own, like irrationalities of my own that I could never before understand. Certain choices that I made that I can now attribute to overconfidence bias or additive solution bias. And that's not to say that writing this book like made me a perfectly rational person and has solved all my problems. That's not it at all. But it has shed light and helped me form some perspective on why I might like overthink and underthink the wrong things. And it's definitely helped me become a little more skeptical of myself and more compassionate toward other people. And that's kind of taken the temperature down on so many of, again, these really like abstract conflicts that have arisen as a result of the information age. And that's ultimately what relates to this question of like, why is it our generation's mission to get a better hold of what is motivating our mind? And I think that's because our conflicts often stem from interactions that are disembodied, which is so new.
yeah, absolutely. I love the I mean, there's like the practicality of some of what you talk about, and there's like this almost universal applicability. Something that I sometimes share with friends or loved ones, particularly when they kind of talk about, they're like, "Oh, well, I don't actually use social media very much." I'm always kind of like, "Congratulations, like it's affecting you anyways."
Totally.
Because it's affecting the jokes comedians tell and the op-eds that you're reading and the podcast conversations people are having. Like it is one of the main heartbeats of culture, I would
It's
argue.
affecting like the whole personality and modus operandi of your kids or your nieces and nephews, nibblings. Like
Yeah.
it is ultimately inescapable, as sad as that sometimes feels.
Totally. Well, maybe we actually kind of go into some of your favorite insights about the book. I was looking at my notes here. You do write about this kind of like the emotional burden of information or too much information, I should say. What do
Yeah.
you want everyone to why did you write this chapter, and what do you want everyone to know, whether they're a therapist or someone who's just kind of generally interested in psychology?
Ooh. Are you referring to which chapter are you referring to in particular? Because there are a few that talk about this overly burdensome onslaught of information.
Well, I'm thinking about, I wrote down one of my favorite quotes, because there were lots of quotes that I really loved as I listened to your book and jotted them down, is the emotional burden of too much information can't always be quelled by more information.
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh. Okay, so that particular quote comes from the confirmation bias chapter in the book, and that's probably the cognitive bias that is most famous, gets the most, airplay. It's our tendency to think that, or it's our tendency to seek out selectively and remember and honor information that validates our existing beliefs while sort of ignoring, casting off, forgetting information that doesn't align with our existing beliefs. And just to kind of give listeners an idea of how this book is structured, basically, I dedicated every chapter to a different cognitive bias, a different sort of mental magic trick, a psychological shortcut that developed for a useful reason at one point, but now has proven not so useful all the time in the information age. This term, cognitive bias, many probably know, was coined by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, behavioral economist high priests. And so I knew that I would need to address confirmation bias in the book because it yeah, it is like kind of the mother of all other cognitive biases and overlaps with all of the other ones. Hundreds of cognitive biases have been described, but in the book I really chose my favorite 11 and used each one to kind of explore some mysterious irrationality that I was perceiving in the culture and in my own behavior. And I sort of start out that confirmation bias chapter by telling an anecdote of a time when this new friend and I decided to go visit a dinosaur museum together, an animatronic dinosaur pop-up exhibit that had come to Los Angeles. And this visit prompted some really interesting conversations because this new friend of mine had grown up in a super evangelical community in Texas, where she had learned that dinosaurs lived alongside Adam and Eve, and the reason why they don't exist now is because God didn't let them on the ark during Noah's Ark, the Great Flood. And conversations like that are really fascinating to me. Again, my second book is about cults, so I love thinking about like religion and irrational belief in that context. And when you hear about people who hold these like fundamentalist, like turbo irrational beliefs, it's common to get this sort of smug feeling, at least in my social circle, where you're like, oh, I would never, trust information like that, like, wow, these people, how could you ever, like, move through the world where there's like so much information about evolution and Darwinism, whatever, and like still stick to your guns. And then, through reading about confirmation bias, and there was this fantastic book that I read for that chapter called "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me" by Carol Tavris and Amos
It's one of my favorite books.
and Elliot Aronson. Yes, so great, super entertaining. It's about cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias through reading texts like that, and talking about these concepts in a new context. The chapter is called "Sorry I'm Late, Must Be Mercury in Retrograde," a note on confirmation bias. So I live in LA where there's a lot of astrology happening, our sort of new evangelicalism, if you will. I was really humbled. I was really, really humbled by how confirmation bias shows up in my own thinking and in my own life. And that's not to say that I'm able to resist it 100% of the time, that there's no way, because if confirmation bias didn't exist, we would be constantly making pros and cons lists about every single decision that we made. Our social reality would, never come into alignment with our values and our choices, and that would just feel totally chaotic and unmanageable. So a little bit of confirmation bias is absolutely necessary just to like move through the world. But a huge theme in this book is developing an awareness of how these biases show up in our own behavior, so that we can be curious about that and ultimately a little more forgiving of other people's irrationalities too.
Yeah, absolutely. No, totally, right? And I love the point you bring up about how just it's like the neurobiology, or like it's the psychology of perception. It's like you wouldn't be able to take a step outside your door, right, if you didn't have some sort of confirmation bias. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't really know like who said it, or if I just kind of like adapted it a little bit and made it my own. But there's that old saying. It's like, well, like seeing is believing, and it's like no. It's like you have beliefs, you have these existing frameworks and experiences, and that informs how you filter in the information that you let in or not.
Totally.
And as a therapist, something I'm thinking about all the time. I'd love to get your opinion on this, because I've been doing a lot of like writing and research, trying to understand like the more deeply, like the art and science of like timing in therapy. And one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about is, okay, like, is this the right moment for what we would call like an empathic confrontation, where it's like you're confronting the person with, you're challenging their perspective or giving them information or trying to, whatever it is that you're trying to do, you're doing it in a compassionate way, like in an empathic way. It's for their treatment. But if it's the wrong intervention, it can be what's called an empathic failure, right? It doesn't mean that the intention wasn't there, but it can cause a rupture in the therapeutic alliance. But B, I'm thinking a lot about this idea of timing, where it's kind of like, if they have been really emotional all session and there was a stressor like at work or in their relationship and you're working on something else, it's like, well, maybe this isn't the right time. That's kind of an obvious one. But I've been trying to apply that in my own life as well. So for an example, just socializing with friends in New York, if someone says something that I find to be, politically problematic, let's just say, it's like, oh, the bar is obviously not the right time, right? Or maybe it
Right.
is, depending. But it's like
Depending.
kind of picking and choosing. It's like, how long have I known this person? Like, did they actually mean what they say? And in a way, I kind of find all of that contemplation paralyzing, but I'm trying to arrive at something a little bit more, like clear for people to, have that grace that you were talking about for other people.
Well, this is so interesting that you bring this up because I've been thinking a lot over the past few years about when you know the sort of like system one versus system two thought processes that Daniel Kahneman talks about or talked about apply best, and sort of like when to sort of like trust my gut and inner voice
Mm,
and not overcomplicate something versus when to apply a more like slow deliberative thought process. And I actually think when it comes to rapport and like social interaction, we all have a lot of natural skills to like read the room and read social interactions that we don't need to like overly apply like deliberative thought to. But I think a lot about rapport and exactly what you're saying, like when is the appropriate time to address a certain subject? How would that like lead to the most effective outcome or perspective shift, particularly in the context of interviewing people for my work? Because what I think about sometimes is that being a therapist and being a journalist or an interviewer are not that different in certain ways. The job of a journalist is to sort of like get someone to disclose intimacies. And that is part of the job of a therapist as well. And that requires like sort of like deep listening, and you can like beef an interaction like so quickly depending on if you like misapply something that you had been thinking about arising with that person to like the wrong moment. But I think a lot about timing, and obviously like some of the chapters in the book talk about how like the relationship between timing and panic and novelty and
mm,
emotion. And yeah, I think like human rapport and human like panic impulses and sensitivities are so fascinating. And I like to think about, when like strategy becomes most effective and when more like intuition becomes most effective.
yeah. You write about intuition in your book, if I'm remembering correctly.
A little bit, yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Well, I remember there, like, I don't know, it came up for me, and like maybe I'm misremembering it or just like applying something that you wrote. But I'm thinking about you. You write a lot about like spirituality, and you kind of talked about like living in LA, and there's like all these like beliefs around like astrology and things. And I know that for me, intuition is it's funny because it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty scientifically validated as a
Yeah,
legitimate construct. You brought the, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, absolutely wonderful book. I also know that if I'm not mistaken, it's like, I know that the United States military has invested who knows how many millions of dollars into developing intuition, just because if you need to be faster, right? Like in like wartime strategy or something like that, it makes sense that you want to know how to like trust your gut a little bit better. But it also kind of feels like with something like confirmation bias that, trusting your immediate like instinct isn't always necessarily the way to go if you don't have that distinction around like, is this
exactly.
just my emotional reaction, or is this like what my gut is telling me to be
It's
true?
so funny that you bring that up because I launched a podcast based on the age of magical overthinking called Magical Overthinkers that would allow
Oh,
me to
cute.
like continue talking about this subject matter or directly address subjects that I was only maybe able to touch on in the book or that ended up on the cutting room floor. And I actually just did an episode titled Overthinking about intuition with this writer named Elizabeth Greenwood, who just put out a book all about intuition. She's a writer and reporter, kind of like me, who's just like a curious person and chooses niches to explore. And I relay a lot of sort of like overthinky questions and thought spirals from my listeners to each week's guest. And there were so many questions asked, like, what is the difference between intuition and OCD? What is the difference between intuition and confirmation bias, between intuition and anxiety? Like there was so much confusion about when can you trust your gut proverbially, and when might your mind and body be leading you astray? And part of what she explained was that intuition, we kind of discussed how intuition like kind of cares about you. Like intuition is like very curious. It's different from anxiety because anxiety is like spiraling out about the future, and intuition is very present and prompts you to sort of like ask questions, tune in, not freak out.
Yeah.
And sometimes your intuition can be wrong. I mean, we discussed how like, and this is kind of pertains to what we were just talking about, like intuition when applied to social situations can often be trusted. Although what even is a social situation in the digital age? Can you trust your intuition with regard to a DM? Is that a social interaction if you can't actually see someone's face or hear their tone? It's like
Yeah.
these are the questions that I spiral about. But yeah, I do think that there is we discussed how there is a difference between sort of relying on cognitive biases that are sort of like misappropriated onto situations that require a little bit more critical thinking, and sort of like having intuition as a tool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I recently put out the episode. One of the people in my life that I found to be very illuminating on this topic of intuition, her name's Shoshana French. She's a self-identified psychic, but the way I got to know her was she's like an intuition coach. Like her whole thing is everybody has it, everybody can develop it, everybody can learn to like trust it better. And I know that I would be really curious to ask her, and I will the next time I have her on, because when I worked with her, it was like learning about like my intuitive instincts. It was a very like internal experience. And so it was kind of like noticing, it's like, well, do thoughts immediately come up about a situation or about whatever it is? Or is it like a feeling, right? Or is it like a bodily sensation that like you can't deny, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was a lot of mindfulness. It was a lot of just
Yeah.
not making what I felt right or wrong, but actually saying like, oh, is this an intuition, or is this like an anxiety, or like, am I not grounded? Am I like, am I somewhere else right now, et cetera, et cetera. But recently I've been thinking about how that's the maybe like the first stage of it, or at least maybe getting better at it. But my hunch, and I don't know if this is the writer you had on the podcast, because the woman I'm thinking of just came out with the book, but her whole thing is like intuition, like you need your eyes open. And like, and it's like this idea of like, no, like don't like, meditate and take deep breaths, like actually like be in the present as fully as you absolutely
Yeah.
can. And it was something about like ER nurses having amazing intuition because they have to be like absorbing all the data.
Yes, I was just watching that show, The Pit, and I was
Oh
thinking a
yeah.
lot about how, because doctors obviously have to rely on critical thinking skills above all else, but they also need to develop bedside manner, and that has so much more to do with intuition and these sort of
Right.
like unquantifiable social things, or maybe they are quantifiable. Again, I could spiral out about how to quantify the human mind for 2 hours, but yes, I think intuition is present but not urgent and panicky. Um, and another thing that I learned from this interview with the writer Liz Greenwood is that she was talking about how she interviewed all these neuroscientists for her book who were like, "Why are you even interested in intuition?" They were like so confused. They were like, "It's just one of so many interesting things about the brain." They were like,
Oh,
so it's not like they were dismissing it. They were just like, "Yeah, intuition. It's like so real. It's one of like a bajillion things that are so interesting about the brain. Like, hello, old news. Um, but yeah, I guess as a self-identified overthinker, thought spiraler, someone who definitely thinks that like if I overthink a subject to death, I can change an outcome. That's kind of another definition of magical overthinking. I definitely like to ruminate on intuition, as sort of ironic and counterintuitive as that might seem.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about the illusory. I'm not even sure if how I'm
The
pronouncing that
illusory
word right.
truth effect. I'm
The
so glad you
illusory
brought that
truth
up.
effect. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, tell everyone what it is if they're not familiar.
Okay, yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because that was the bias from the book that I thought of as we were having this conversation. So the illusory truth effect is defined by our tendency to think that something is true just because we've heard it multiple times. It's like deceptively simple bias, where we confuse processing fluency or familiarity with a statement with accuracy. And it is one of the most powerful cognitive biases that we have, to the point that even an awareness of it does not defang it or discourage us from falling prey to it. I cited the work of this memory scientist named Lisa Fazio throughout that chapter, who discovered that, children as young as 5 start to learn that when you hear a statement once, then twice, then 3 times, it must be true. There are studies showing that even if you present participants with disclaimers that a source is unreliable, or even if a piece of information like completely um, negates previous real knowledge, like a statement including, fish can breathe air, or like Mars is the largest planet. If you say it multiple times, people will start to internalize it as true. And this was once a useful enough, efficient way of understanding and processing information. You can imagine a time before the information age when we were living in relatively small communities. And if you
Mm,
heard someone, or multiple people say multiple times that the berries at the outskirts of the woods are dangerous, it would probably behoove you not to go near the berries or eat the berries. Hearing information multiple times is a decent clue that a sentiment is more true than a one-off factoid, but the illusory truth effect can prove harrowing in environments where there's a lot of ambient mis or even disinformation, like social media.
mm.
And, there are complementary biases like the rhyme as reason effect, which suggests that when sentiments rhyme, they come across as more true than sentiments that don't rhyme. So this one study found that participants will rate the phrase woes unite foes as sounding more true than
Oh.
woes unite enemies, even though they mean the same thing.
Mm,
So, it's interesting
yeah.
because this explains so much of why, really catchy but ultimately untrue or sort of misleading sentiments can spread so far and wide and seem true online. And even though an awareness of this bias is not enough to quiet it, we can use it to our advantage and constantly repeat true information in rhyming ways.
I think that the line from the book that I recall that was something like, it's like repetition is the closest thing we have to a spell or something like that.
Yes, I
Yeah.
know the power of language. It is amazing how much we underrate the power of even a technique as simple as
Hmm.
repetition to affect the way we think. And the reason why I thought of this bias, when we were talking about intuition, is that there are so many sort of like heavily repeated proverbs that get tossed around in English and other languages too. English is the language I'm most familiar with, but that sort of like counter one another. Like when it comes to life advice where there isn't something where there is no like objective truth. There are many ways to approach certain problems, like how in English we have sort of opposite phrases like haste makes waste, but also the early bird gets the worm. Those sort of mean like the
Hmm.
opposite things to each other. um but they're both useful because like in some situations you don't want to act too
Right.
quickly because it could be wasteful or, unwise. But then in some situations, you don't want to be inert. You want to act fast. Like those are both true. And I find that it's important when it comes to, the sort of aspects of life where maybe intuition is important. I think it's telling that we have so many sort of like counter perspectives in the form of these heavily repeated proverbs, and that shows us that like, there are aspects of life where like there is no way to arrive at an answer through deliberative thought. Like you ultimately have to listen to all of these pieces of life wisdom and come to your own decision.
Yeah, absolutely. The one that's coming up for me that's tossed around a lot of therapy and self-help circles is this idea of like, if you spot it, you got it, which is about like projection. So like if there's like
Oh,
a quality of yours that's like really bothering me, for whatever reason, it's kind of like, oh, that's because, I have that quality, or because my mom did, and it's like, it's triggering something or whatever it is. And I do believe in projection. I'm not saying it isn't real, but I'm more kind of like, to your point, it's like, well, sometimes if you
yeah.
spot it, you got it. Or it's like, I may just not appreciate people that have fill in the blank, quality or trait that doesn't agree with me for whatever reason.
Or maybe it's frequency bias, and this is something that you just noticed in someone or that someone just pointed out to you. And so now you're seeing
Mm.
more examples of it, like,
Oh yeah, it's
but
true.
I will now internalize that as true because it rhymes. Like that's why I'm saying it's like, no matter how like smart we consider ourselves, like Dr. Seuss had something going on,
Oh.
Like,
Well, there's the rhyming piece, but the repetition of it.
yes,
What I find so, I don't know if alarming is the right word, even though it is alarming. It's also very hopeful in some ways, is how you don't actually need to hear the thing that many times to
true.
start to be comfortable with it. You know what I mean? Because I feel like sometimes people hear of it and they think of, oh, well, I have to hear this like, talking point disseminated through multiple media sources like 100 times, and then I'll believe it. I know that for me, just personally in my, both in my practice, but even in my personal life, I can think of many instances where it happens all the time if I'm facilitating like a new group for psychotherapy, where you'll try to set norms of the group. And, as the therapist, as the group leader, like you may kind of lead by example, by being vulnerable or whatever it might be. And people will feel uncomfortable. They'll feel awkward. Like they'll giggle, they'll laugh, they'll
Hmm.
refuse to participate. But you just have to double down 2 or 3 times. And all of a sudden you watch everyone like get out of their heads and they just go into whatever mode it was. And it does feel magical a lot of
Yes.
ways, you
Yeah,
know?
and that can work for good and for ill, Like
Hmm.
I podcast as well, and when you podcast long enough and when the frequency is high enough, you will probably, well, maybe not you, but most people will probably end up sharing something on the mic that isn't totally true by
Right.
accident. Um,
Yeah.
and I sort of confess to a situation when I did that on my podcast, Sounds Like a Cult, which is an entertainment podcast ultimately, but I do care about sharing things that are true, or or putting
Right.
or putting the word allegedly in front and behind wherever possible. But anyways, this is like kind of a low stakes example, but it was disturbing to me nonetheless, and I ended up incorporating this anecdote into the chapter. But we did an episode years ago on the cult of weddings, where we were, unpacking and critiquing the wedding industry, which is so cult-like and conformist and consumerist, and I hate it. But I came across this factoid across not a ton, but maybe like, 4 or 5, maybe half a dozen sources online, that the origin of the bridal bouquet was that in medieval times, brides would carry flowers down the aisle because they barely bathed and were so stinky.
Oh.
And like wanted to mask their stench because it was like medieval Europe and like peasants never bathed. And I saw this factoid shared in like bridal magazines, on forums, and here's the thing. It seemed like a juicy fact. We
Yeah.
love factoids that just feel good to know. And maybe sometimes they feel good to know because they rhyme and that feels very like organizable in the mind. Maybe it's that they're pithy or that they were shared in a highly legible, beautiful font in a quotegram. Like we like facts that go down easy. And this fact was so sort of like short and juicy and funny. Humor is another technique that helps information spread. I was like, oh, I gotta share this on the pod. Did I do a deep fact check? Of course not. Like it was
Right.
shared across enough sources, including magazines and such, and I was like, good enough. And I was also like, oh, what's the worst thing that could happen if this isn't quite true? Like I'm not defaming anyone. Like it's
Right.
lore. Like is it misinformation or Your Honor? It was lore. So I shared this thing online, and this factoid resonated with people. It spread far and wide. There was a tweet that went viral about it. And then an actual medievalist came forward and was like, actually, people in medieval times really, really did bathe. And I reached out to this medievalist because I was so disturbed. I was like, I know about fact checking. I was like, I know about. I was
Oh
like,
my
I
God.
I should be above this. Her name was Eleanor Janega, and we got on this conversation where she was teaching me facts that were so much cooler than this fake origin story of the bridal bouquet about this period between ancient Rome and Martin Luther's age, and this was kind of my gateway into learning about the illusory truth effect and the power that it
Mm.
has in the social media age. And that was like the gift of this book, is that I would like start out agog and aghast at like some irrational behavior on my own part or on the part of someone else. And then it ended up being this invitation to learn more about, yeah, these like innately irrational, but ultimately once serviceable techniques that we unconsciously use to make decisions, and how they're colliding with these times, but how that doesn't necessarily mean, and basically what we can do with that information to be like better, more conscious, and more empathetic humans.
What are some of the insights from your book that you wish every therapist knew? And
Mm,
I'll kind of, as you let that question kind of like simmer, I'll kind of qualify it with two distinctions. There's like for their patients that they should be like looking out for. So I don't know, I don't think you talk about it in the book, but I remember learning from like a social psych class in grad school, but this idea of like the illusion of transparency, this idea that you overestimate the degree to which people can read your emotional state, right? I'm talking about to my patients all the time because they need to remember that it's like, no, you actually have to communicate what's going on in order for this to work. But then there's also, I feel like, therapists are also people, right? Like we're also living in this world. We're so dizzy with information and mental health. The destigmatization has been lovely, but the popularization has brought some problems. There's misinformation.
certainly.
There's the misappropriation of different terms. So, what would you want therapists to kind of keep in mind in terms of navigating our age of magical overthinking?
Oh, wow. This is not in the book as much, although I do have a whole chapter about an Instagram therapist in the book, that I explore through the lens of something called proportionality bias, which is our tendency to think that big events or even just big feelings must have had a big cause.
Mm,
And that's the bias informing conspiratorial thinking, but also ideas of manifestation, which I argue are a conspiracy theorist
yeah.
of, or a conspiracy theory of their own. Anywho, I did write a piece after the book came out for Harper's Bazaar about the overuse and sometimes misuse of therapy speak in the workplace. And
Mm.
that was a fascinating opportunity to explore the sort of pros and cons of the proliferation of therapy terms. And I tend to get like a little paranoid about, like the bastardization of certain terms or their mainstreaming when they sort of like dilute the clinical value of a certain term. But then I spoke to linguists who reminded me that, this is how language evolves, especially in the digital age. And it was a really cool piece. It's called How Therapy Speak Became became the love language of the modern workplace. It's on my website, and if
Oh,
anybody wants to
amazing.
give it a read. But the bias that came to mind when you asked that question was the first one that I addressed in the book, which is the halo effect, which is
Mm,
our inclination to make overall positive assumptions about a person's character based on our appreciation of one single trait. And
mm.
I explore this bias in the context of celebrity worship. So, the chapter's called Are You My Mother, Taylor Swift? A note on the halo effect. And I sort of, characterize the halo effect this way. If you admire, say, a pop star's music, their songs, their lyrics, you might jump to the conclusion that they are also nurturing, worldly, highly educated, that their political values align with yours,
Right.
etc.
Yes.
And this halo effect is based on, old ways that we used to find role models in our real life communities. You would see someone
Hmm.
in your town, your hunter-gatherer community who had big muscles and intact teeth, and you might jump to the conclusion that they were a skilled hunter and warrior who had eaten a lot of meat and avoided disfigurement from battle, and thus that would be a good person for you to align with for survival purposes. It was like an imperfect but ultimately decent
Hmm.
conclusion to jump to. And we're now sort of mapping that impulse onto parasocial relationships with celebrities who are now not just here to entertain us, they are so much more to us. They are our parasocial lovers, gods, leaders in so many
Mm.
ways. And I also think that the halo effect can apply in a big way to therapists, particularly therapists who have a big online presence. And so, I definitely like admire, if not worship, certain mental health authorities in my real life, as well as some that I see online. And being aware of that halo effect is a good self-protective mechanism for both the therapist and the client or follower, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing that I found, I do identify as a Swiftie, so I really loved that chapter
You
specifically
didn't feel too
using.
called out.
No, no, because I'm not that much of a Swiftie, so I
No,
felt.
actually, I feel like a bit. I feel Swifty passing. I feel
Yeah.
like a Swifty whisperer, if you will.
Oh, totally. Well, for those who haven't read the book, the test case that Amanda uses for talking about the halo effect is all this research that's been done on Taylor Swift's fan base and just other kind of figures of celebrity or figures of public interest. And one thing that it was, because I mean, at this point, I had first gone over the book quite a while ago, and so I was right in the middle of really adjusting to learning what it means to have a public presence. And something, I think, like a gift that chapter gave me, and maybe I don't, I would be curious to hear from you because I don't think it was necessarily the intention of the chapter, but I do think it made me a little bit bolder and more vulnerable being myself online and not really internalizing the like, oh, someone doesn't like me, or there's like, this post feels fairly divisive or whatever it is, just because it's the nature of the parasocial relationships that you write about. And for me, it was actually quite liberating to learn about, every person, even the Taylor Swifts, of fame. And I don't aspire to, ever be quite that famous or
That reflects well on
recognizable,
you.
but even they are going through these peaks and valleys of how much people like them, depending on all sorts of factors. I thought that was really insightful.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad that
Yeah.
chapter had that effect on you. I wish it had that effect on me. But
Oh.
no, yeah, I find the whole parasocial aspect of it and in intimacy and admiration in this age to be so fascinating. And I actually I do this live show called the Big Magical Cult Show. That's like kind of a combination of some ideas in the age of magical overthinking and cultish, where I give a parasocial PowerPoint, I call it. And it's very meta because like the people in the audience may or may not have somewhat of a parasocial relationship with me, and there I am critiquing parasocial relationships but also leaning into the parasocial relationship that I have with this audience.
Mm.
And I have a slide in this PowerPoint. It's kind of like a cheeky TED talk is I guess the best way to describe it, but I have a slide in that PowerPoint where I talk about the phenomenon of parasocial breakups, which I explored in a certain context in the chapter, but explore more head on in this show. And I don't know if you've ever seen in the comment section of celebrities' posts where I guess they've shared something that betrayed certain followers' expectations of who they were based on the halo effect. And the person goes to comment on the post and they're like, oh my God, Barbara Streisand, I don't know, whoever, Tom Holland, literally whoever. I can't believe you said this about this. So disappointed, a longtime fan, but I'm unfollowing. And then sometimes other people will clamor to that comment and be like, Jimmy, this isn't an airport. You don't need to announce your departure. Have you ever seen interactions like
Yes,
that?
it's
Yeah,
become, it's like a, it's, yes, it's a meme, but it's something I spend a little too much time in comment sections, but it is my job in my defense.
indeed.
But I see it all the time.
Yeah, and
It's like, yeah.
I think it's really shedding light on the uncanniness of parasocial breakups because normally when you end a relationship with someone IRL, there's at least the closure of like you two knowing each other and there being some kind of awareness on both sides that this was a relationship once and now it's ending. But in a
Mm,
parasocial dynamic, you have
yeah.
invested so much one-sided attention and resources into this dynamic. Now this person has betrayed you, but maybe they've just been themselves the whole entire time and you just weren't aware of that side of them. Now
Mm,
you are aware and you've decided that you don't want to be a part of the dynamic anymore, but it's going to feel too anticlimactic and your delusion is going to occur to you too much if you just disappear quietly. So you feel the need to
yeah.
announce your departure. And of course, that person doesn't know you and doesn't care. You know, maybe
Right.
abstractly they care about disappointing their followers, but not at the expense of their authenticity. At least I hope not, or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
But I find these dynamics fascinating right now.
Yeah. No, totally. I know that for me, the New York is often like the number one city in terms of percentage of followers, and it's where I live, and lots of people live here. And I don't walk around being like I'm famous or like I have like a public presence. Like I walk around like me, like Joe Nucci. You know what I mean? Like I kind of, I wake up, I go to the gym, I give some therapy, I film a video,
Yeah.
I, write, like I go on with my day. And it happens frequently enough for me to have a kind of ascertained a certain pattern, but infrequently enough where I'm always surprised when it does happen. But people will, infrequently like approach me, and like I'll be like at the gym or like at a party or like whatever it is, and everyone's always super cool and like super sweet, and it's never an unpleasant interaction for me. And like, and because it happens so infrequently, I'm like, oh, like this is kind of fun, you know what I mean?
Totally.
And it's always really interesting, at least for me, I find it to be very very obvious when the halo starts to dim, if you will,
Oh,
where
yeah.
they realize that it's like, wait, he doesn't want to be really like witty and sassy and a little contrarian and talk about psychology right now. And it's like, no, dude, like I'm at a party, like can you get me a beer or like whatever? It's like it's just
I know.
it's so, and so it's kind of like the saying, like, don't meet your heroes or whatever. But it's it was funny, I shared to my audience, my Spotify Wrapped let me know that I was in the top 4% of educational podcast listeners. Not
Okay,
surprising,
slay.
super nerdy, super curious, and it made sense for my audience, who is also very like nerdy and curious. And I got all of these messages and comments that was like, wait, we want to see your music, like we want to see your music. And
Oh,
so
hilarious.
I share the music, and it's kind of a funny application of like the halo effect, because I imagine they were thinking it was something like unique and cool, because I'm often showing them a cool framework or philosophy that they hadn't heard of, right? That's, I'm assuming, why a lot of people follow me. But my top 5 of last year were like Taylor Swift and
Was it
Chapel Roan. There's a
basic?
bunch of like music like gay dudes listen to. Like it was so basic.
Yeah.
And it got like 0 engagement because people saw it and they're probably like, oh, that's disappointing. And it
Yeah,
just
they were like
cracked me
off
up.
brand. I know, I
Totally.
know. Oh my God, that reminds me of that meme that's like, the Walt Whitman quote that's like, I contain multitudes or whatever. And then the meme that's like, I contain multitudes and some of those bitches have got to go. It's like my multitude that has, I remember something similar happened to me. I like posted an Instagram Reels last year where I I have a bookshelf in my house that, God forbid, is color organized. Okay. It's not organized by title. It's not organized by author. It's not Dewey Decimal System. It's organized in a fucking rainbow. Okay. So sue me. And some people were like eye twitching and hemorrhaging and aneurysming because I have a rainbow bookshelf. And I don't know, I guess they assumed I was like more intellectual than that. I'm like, no, babe, I love rainbows. Like I am just like, don't begrudge me a goddamn rainbow, you
Oh
know?
my gosh. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. As we get closer to the end, I wanted to loop back to proportionality bias that you brought up earlier.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you write about it. You might know better than me. But one of the things that I've personally observed as a therapist is that I think that sometimes proportionality bias. I think it's a quirk of our cognition. Like I think everybody does it. But B,
Totes.
it seems to be particularly common in survivors of trauma. Because the idea that like, oh, like this big thing, happened to me, it must have been for like a very big identifiable reason, or like the meaning of it on me must be very big because it's impacting me so much now. And it can really like alter the course of someone's life. And I wanted to bring it up because I am recalling how you write about that a lot of kind of like the conspiratorial thinking that tries to match these levels of, I don't know what you would call it, like not intensity, but basically this idea of like, well, the bigger the event, the bigger the cause, when really like it can like, people can go to war, they can get into a car accident, they walk away with no trauma symptoms whatsoever. And sometimes like the littlest things can cause some pretty severe trauma symptoms as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I would venture to say that it might not only be trauma, it could even be something like burnout. I came across a really interesting
Mm,
study while I was researching a Magical Overthinkers episode about burnout, in which I interviewed Amelia Nagoski, who's one of the co-authors of this great book about burnout. And I came across a study talking about how paranoia is actually a kind of unexpected symptom of burnout. If you are generally like
huh.
overstressed, you might start to think that like the world is out to get you. And I have
Right.
experienced
Yeah.
that in my life
Totally.
majorly. Like when I'm super sensitive and touchy and burnt out, I can start to think that like, yeah, the littlest inconvenience is because the world is out to get me. And I think that has very much to do, I touch on this in the chapter, but with like external versus internal locuses of control or loci of
Mm,
control. Um, and how if you feel generally like the external world is dominating what happens to you and that you have very little agency in your life, proportionality bias will probably be dilated up for you, or sorry, dialed up for you. Yeah, I think that there are a number of unpleasant life experiences that could cause, extra proportionality bias to apply.
yeah, absolutely. Well, as much as I want to keep on nerding out with you, I will have to start to wrap it up. I loved how you wrote about loci of control. Is it loci? Loci? I don't
I
even know.
don't know.
It's okay.
Oh my
We
God.
just talk for a living. Like, why would
This
we
is
know?
well, but okay, this is funny too, and I think this has to do with the halo effect too. I'm like, okay, yes, I write about linguistics and I love language, but sometimes I've only ever read a word. Sometimes I've never heard it
Oh,
said. This happens, so I pronounce it
right.
wrong. And again, I podcast so much, sometimes I mispronounce words, and people are scandalized. I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce every single word in the
Oh my
dictionary.
gosh. I think that I mean maybe that was just my first one, but I think that my time is certainly coming just in terms of all the content output that I have. And it's so funny because I'm very bookish, like I read a lot, I listen to a lot, I'm very intellectually curious, but pronunciations are one of my gaps in knowledge. My mom will never let me forget the moment where she had to like I'm 6'2". My mom is much shorter than me, and so I had to like reach
Flex.
something on like a top shelf, and I go, what did I say? I go, oh, it was like which dish, and I go, oh, which is your preference? And
Oh,
she she brings it up to this next.
That's so
I know
cute.
that it's pronounced preference. It was just like in that moment. It's just how it came
I
out.
know. This is what happens. It's like, okay, the last time this happened to me on the podcast was I do you know the wrestling term kayfabe? Have
No.
you ever heard? Okay, it's a cool concept that describes sort of well, it relates to the suspension of disbelief between wrestling fans and actual wrestlers who are like doing a performance, but it actually seems
Oh.
real, whatever. And I was applying that word to like a cultish context in one episode of Sounds Like a Cult, but I had only ever read it. Like, I'm not a wrestling fan. I had only ever read this word. And so on the podcast, I pronounced it K-Fob-A. And
Oh
it
my
was like
God.
a major hooked on phonics moment. Like, the listeners were explosive in letting me know that it was actually kayfabe. So I will never live that
Yeah.
down. Kayfabe.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, one of my beliefs is that, and we're starting to see it now, is the stuff that seems to really resonate in the media sphere are those little imperfect moments because I think it lets the viewer know that it's this wasn't completely AI generated and scripted.
I
This is a
know.
real person, and you know, like the authenticity, the vulnerability, that is always what seems to do really well. One of my most viral videos, instead of specific, I'm trying to talk really fast, and I say specific. I go specifical or something, and I go,
That's
and it's just
cute.
it doesn't matter in a lot of ways because
No,
people
it
knew
doesn't
what I was
matter.
going for.
Yeah,
So
totally. That sounds like a
yeah.
wicked way of saying, you know,
Oh my God, totally.
like moodified and specifical. Sorry.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. I like that how you talk about, you know, where a lot in the book about like the internal versus the internal locus of control. I talk about it in my book that's coming out later in the year. We'll have to get together again to talk about it
Would
when it's
love that.
closer.
Fuck yeah.
And you are coming out with a book very, very soon. Well, it'll be out now by the time this airs. So why don't you tell the listeners where they can find it and
Oh,
what it's about?
yes. Well, my second book, Cultish, is finally coming out in paperback with like a new cute little cover revamp. It'll be out May 27th, wherever you buy books. It is a super fun exploration of the language of cults from Scientology to Soul Cycle. I think that's all you need to know. And I'm going on tour for it. So if you're, or a mini tour, if you're in New York or LA, come to the Big Magical Cult Show. It'll be so fun.
All right. Well, I'll definitely be there. And for those of you, regardless of where you live, if you're still listening, make sure to hit that like or subscribe button and stay tuned for our next episode of Psychobabble.